Okay, let's make a start. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Paul Meserol, and I'm privileged to be the Pro-Vice Chancellor of the Arts Education and Law Group. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 7th Annual Arts Education Law Professorial Lecture. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land on which we gather this evening, in particular to the Jagera people and the Turrbal people. And I want to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I've got a number of people I want to acknowledge who are here this evening. Ian Stewart, APM, Commissioner of the Queensland Police. Welcome, Ian. Mr. Bob Atkinson, AO and APM, and former Commissioner of the QPS. Welcome, Bob. Judge Ian Dearden from District Court, Queensland. Welcome, Judge Dearden. Mr. Alan McSporn, Chair of the CCC Crime and Corruption Commission. Welcome, Alan. Dr. Nicola Stepanoff, the Queensland Integrity Commissioner. Welcome, Nicola. Mr. Bob G, Deputy Commissioner of the QPS. Welcome, Bob. And indeed, welcome Professor Janet Ransley, our distinguished speaker this evening. And welcome to you, one and all, for making the effort to join us on a rainy Monday evening at the Queensland Conservatorium and to hear from Professor Janet Ransley about the Arts Education and Law Professorial Lecture as she delivers that in a matter of moments. Just a bit of background for those of you who aren't from Griffith. As many of you know, we're a very young university. Been around, our doors have opened in 1975, but since that time we've been working very hard to be a university of influence, a university committed to providing first-rate learning opportunities for our students, a university committed to supporting staff to undertake research on many of the pressing social problems facing our community, a university committed to delivering a social dividend, in other words, to build knowledge that translates to making a real difference for the community. A university that's committed to effective partnerships that allows us to leverage capacity to make a difference in the community. And finally, a university that wants to showcase its professors and their achievements to the wider community, which is why we find ourselves here this evening. For those of you who are not aware, our group, the Arts Education and Law Group, is the social, legal, educational, and cultural driver of Griffith University. We're arguably the most diverse in terms of academic character, research achievements, and our academic content. Our AEL community includes committed researchers, educators, working to find solutions to the problems we experience today and help shape the young people who will be the leaders for tomorrow. So things like diversity, social engagement, social justice, social impact, represent many of the key descriptors that capture what our academic community is about. So we strive to reflect a microcosm of a truly progressive community, in other words, to be intellectually rich, professionally engaged, culturally aware and connected, responsive to community, as well as innovative and creative. It's within that context that we're very proud to host the AEL Professorial Lecture, and our speaker tonight represents another example of the intellectual depth we are so blessed with at Griffith University. We take great pleasure in showcasing the intellectual capital of our professoriate community, and this year's speaker, Professor Janet Ransley, is an excellent representative of our community. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce Janet to you as our speaker for 2018. So she's a professor and director of the Griffith Criminology Institute, and she leads the Institute's Policing and Security Research area. Janet undertakes research on policing, regulatory approaches to crime reduction, crime and justice policy, and integrity in criminal justice, legal and political systems and practices. She is also highly experienced in evaluating programs and interventions in justice settings. From 2011 to 2015, Janet was the head of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice, and before that time, she acted as director for the Key Centre for Ethics, Law, Justice and Governance, which now forms a key subcomponent of the Griffith Criminology Institute. Before entering academia, Janet held several senior policy positions with the Queensland Government, including as Research Director for the Legislative Assembly, for which she was lead author on over 20 policy-relevant research reports on major legislative and policy initiatives. She also worked in senior roles for the Criminal Justice Commission, the Carruthers Inquiry in 1995, and the Bingham Review of the Queensland Police Service in 1996. As an academic, she's co-authored or edited 6 books and collections and over 60 research articles and chapters. She has extensive experience in managing multidisciplinary project teams and in liaising and collaborating with public sector partners, and she has a very strong interest in promoting industry research relationships and partnerships that generate evidence to support better criminal justice policy and practice. So Janet is truly an extraordinary leader at Griffith, and nationally she's well known as an expert in police and security and integrity. So with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Janet Ransley to deliver the 2018 AEL Professorial Lecture. Janet?
Thank you very much, Paul. And I too wish to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Turrbal and Jagera people, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I want to thank Pro-Vice-Chancellor Paul Mazerol of the Arts Education and Law Group at Griffith University for the invitation to deliver this lecture. It's a great honour, and I'm truly humbled to be asked, and that so many people have turned up on a rainy Monday evening to hear my somewhat random thoughts. Paul has already acknowledged several notable people in the audience, so I won't go through that again, other than to mention and thank my colleagues from Griffith University who are here as well tonight and who've given me so much support and friendship over the past 20 years of my academic career. I'm also honoured that there are so many representatives here tonight from the Queensland Police Service. It's been my great privilege to work closely with a great number of them during the past 10 years or so, and I've learnt a great deal. As well as being honoured that they're here, I'm pretty nervous to be talking to a largely police audience about policing and telling them how I think they should suck eggs. But at this point, I would like to point out that, in fact, this talk is not so much about what I think police should be doing, but what I think our communities, media and government should expect of police. I think it's more about us than it is about police and policing, although I can't help myself in having some observations about that as well. So what is my topic? As I've mentioned, it's really about what we ask police to do and what we should ask them to do, what we should ask them to do. But before I start on that, I would like to give some background about why I care about this and how I got caught up in police and policing as an academic interest. So I'm going to go back to the beginning and talk about during my childhood when I had absolutely no contact with police whatsoever. Never came across a police officer, never thought about police, except perhaps as that invisible comforting presence that as a child in my generation was the way that we thought of police and police officers. So somebody who was there if we needed help. So I'm thinking about that picture in the top left-hand corner of the slide, that very friendly British Bobby who would be there if I got lost or lost my pet dog. I didn't have a pet dog, but the police would have helped me find it if I had. My first real interaction with police was as a young university student. This was Brisbane, late 1970s, early 1980s, law student, UQ, Bjelke-Petersen era of street marches, street bans, apartheid protests and harassment of opposing voices. Those of you who remember those days will know that picture in the top right-hand corner because it shows how we thought of police in those days. We were opposing forces. To me, police were the enemy at that point, the violent, oppressive arm of an oppressive state. I was very young and things were very black and white, but that's how the perception of young people, at least, of police was around that time. And this was also my introduction to the political context of policing and how it can shape what police do and as a consequence what the community thinks of police. Because the reason that police were in those situations was actually the political context rather than choices of their own. A few years later, as a novice solicitor, I did my obligatory stint as duty lawyer at the Old Magistrates Court in Brisbane. Monday mornings in particular were instructive. We would see a parade of people who'd been picked up over the weekend coming through the court. They were mostly there for the old trinity of offences, public drunkenness, obscene language, resist arrest and the like. They were mostly repeat guests of the court, the same faces recycling through on a regular basis, well known to police, prosecutors, magistrates, and they all got on pretty well. This was not the adversarial justice system that I'd been taught about at UQ. This was something completely different. It was a process. Police as street cleaners, part of a well-oiled machine that everyone accepted and understood, including the offenders and the accused. My strongest memory of that time is of making what I thought was a pretty good mitigation plea for a very polite older gentleman and looking down to where he sat next to me in court, he nodded gratefully and then raised the brown paper bag he held in his hand and took a good slug from the bottle that was inside it. I still don't know how he smuggled it in, but everybody in the court laughed. It was a very friendly place. So policing as a process was how I came to think about policing at that point in time. And that was emphasised again a few years later when I had my first experience as a crime victim. This was the late 1980s, early 1990s, during what we now know was the property crime boom in Australia. I was burgled 4 or 5 times in quick succession, which was not unusual. I now know that that's repeat victimisation, didn't know it at the time. Police would attend my house, they'd give me a report so that I could claim from my insurance company, and often tell me they had a fair idea who the culprits were, but that there was little they could do unless they'd actually caught them in the act. Again, I saw police at this point as a fairly passive cog in an administrative process, reduced, as one author has described it, to the role of a note taker with a gun. I looked to them for guardianship from crime, but that role was actually filled by my insurance company, which told me to install deadlocks and window locks or they'd double my premium. I did that, the burglars moved on. Not only was policing a process, but it was not one really concerned with preventing crime. That was a role to be filled by others, in this case the insurance companies. In the mid-1990s, I got to see policing from a different perspective again when I had the chance to work with the then Criminal Justice Commission, as Paul has already mentioned. That was the post-Fitzgerald era when QPS had been laid bare. The politicisation and corruption that I'd only glimpsed as a student had been fully exposed, and the organisation was, I think it's fair to say, pretty gutted. It was not just the corruption, but also the ineffectiveness in dealing with crime and preventing crime and responding to crime and archaic practices. If they couldn't verbal suspects, what were police to do? Now, of course, that's a gross generalisation. Not all police were engaged in those kinds of activities. But to an outside viewer, watching the daily takeouts from the Fitzgerald inquiry, that came to be very much the perception of policing. In the CJC, I got to see the police organisation being rebuilt and to think about questions like what could bring both integrity and effectiveness to the core policing mission. And even more fundamentally, what is the core policing mission, which had never occurred to me before. Then I moved into academia, and one day a small cyclone came into my office and said she needed a lawyer to help write a book about policing. That, of course, was my colleague Lorraine Mazerol, and that was the start of my academic interest in police. Researching and writing that book gave me a crash course in the idea that actually police could have a role in preventing crime, but that modern policing practices held them back from doing that. So it wasn't a conscious choice, it was a way that policing had evolved over time. And then again, a few years later, I got the opportunity to take part in something called the Australasian Policing Forum. Over 2 or 3 years, I was lucky enough to spend regular time with a select group of police leaders from around the region, including Commissioner Ian Stewart, as he now is. He wasn't at that point, but he went on to become. That forum was my introduction to police as leaders of complex organisations with their own bureaucratic and political ecosystems. These were educated, thoughtful and dedicated leaders. They weren't oppressors. They were trying to navigate a path towards improved social outcomes in an often highly politicised environment. I got a glimpse of the challenge involved in trying to change frontline practices in a large, complex and hierarchical organisation that, like most such organisations, was quite resistant to change. And then finally, over the last 10 years or so, I've been lucky enough to work with quite a few more dedicated and thoughtful police officers at different levels in many different settings throughout Queensland. I've been able to go along on ride-alongs with officers dealing with complex and often volatile problems. I've seen them trying to avert community riots, diffuse violent confrontations, protect vulnerable victims and offenders, calm intoxicated schoolies, perhaps the most challenging task of all, and respond to natural disasters. I should point out that in the picture here in the bottom right-hand corner, it's not that I'm being apprehended. It does look a little like that, but actually those two very nice officers had spent the night driving me around and allowing me to observe their activities and sharing what they'd been doing. I have to stay honest and say that during that time I've also seen on occasion officers push the extent of their legal powers, target people based on assumptions that I think were pretty questionable, and sometimes contribute to or worsen the problems that they've been trying to control. After all, no system is perfect and no system is full of perfect people. Don't get me started on universities. But I have seen how police have had to deal with the fallout of social and economic forces way beyond their training and remit. They confront mental illness, addiction, deprivation, abuse and neglect. They see the victims of these forces pulled into the criminal justice vortex. And I'm sure this is not what many police feel they're signing on for when they first start in the job. Looking back, I can see how my perception of policing has evolved through that cycle of photos that you see up there, from that childhood feeling of a protective force, through seeing that violent nature of police as oppressors, through to a sort of a passive part of the sausage machine of the criminal justice process. And then I got to see the police organisation and its challenges, and finally I've witnessed policing in action, what police actually do at the front line. And so all of this has led me to my central conundrum that I want to talk about for the rest of tonight. What do we, meaning the public and our governments, really want police to do? And how can we allow them to actually do that job better? My hypothesis is that what we really want is closest to my childhood view, a safe and secure community. Indeed, the person generally agreed to be the founder of modern policing, Sir Robert Peel, said that the primary role of police is to protect the community, not to catch offenders, not to enforce the law, but to protect the community. And that's not just from crime, but from a whole range of other potential harms, like neighbourhood disputes, abuse and neglect, and natural disasters like floods, as we've seen in this state. But the other part of my argument is that's not how contemporary policing is framed in the public imagination in contemporary times. Instead, when we think of police, we think of their law enforcement role, especially in apprehending and arresting offenders. Government rhetoric is about crackdowns and zero tolerance. In the media, we see police hunt murderers and serial rapists, not mediating family and neighbourhood disputes or nudging addicts gently on the footpath in the middle of the night to keep them from falling off to sleep and perhaps unconsciousness. My argument is that we'll all be a lot safer if police are allowed to focus less on law enforcement and more on reducing crime and its associated harms. But that also means that we, the public and governments, have to change our perceptions and expectations of police and the policing role. So to expand on this, for the rest of my talk, I'm going to cover 5 main things. First, the myths that we have about police and crime. Then I'll move on to talk about what police actually do. Thirdly, I'll talk about what we know about crime and other social harms. Then I'll talk about the idea of harm and harm reduction and what I mean by that. And then finally, I'll ask what a harm reduction approach to policing might look like. So let's turn to myths about policing and crime. And the main thing that I think I've learned over the past 10 years or so is that most of us have very little idea of what police actually do and what policing is really like. This is not helped by some of these common myths. And let's start with the biggest myth of all, still so widespread that it seems to be believed by everyone except for criminologists. The big myth is that crime is getting worse. We see this in the media, we hear it from politicians, but in fact, crime rates have steeply declined throughout the Western world for the last 20 years or so, and in Australia since at least the early 2000s. This trend is seen for almost all types of crime, ranging from homicides to theft offences. It's also true of almost all categories of offenders, including young people, despite the stories that we hear in the media about out-of-control youth crime. So I've got just a few graphs which show you the general picture, and all you really need to look at is the direction of the lines, because they're all going down. This graph shows the overall drop in offending in Queensland over the last 20 years across a number of different categories. The key message is the lines are trending down and continuing to do so. This one breaks that up into crimes of violence and property crimes. again, the key message is crime has been trending down. If we look at specific offences, and I've cheated here because this data is actually from New South Wales, which is much better about publishing its data in trend form than Queensland is, but the story is the same for Queensland. Even murder has been trending down, and there aren't many countries in the world where that's actually true, along with some of the more common offences like burglaries. So the main message is crime has been dropping steadily. There are some exceptions to this. When we look at things like sexual offences, domestic violence and child abuse, there's evidence to show some increases in rates in those offences over time, although what we don't know is how much this is due to increased reporting rather than increased offending. What we do know is that a lot of victims are far more confident about coming forward and reporting those offences now than they were 20 years ago, and that may be what we see when we see increases in those categories. So criminologists have a range of explanations for why this big crime drop has happened, but the main point that I want to make is that it has happened. We still see occasional blips where this year, if we compare the data to last year, there may be a slight increase in car thefts, for example, or in assaults, but the long-term trend is pretty stable. We're less able to explain why this myth is so prevalent among the public, media, governments, and even some police that I've spoken to, who all tell me that crime is definitely on the increase. Perhaps as academics and researchers, we need to reflect on our own failure to properly inform the public, and especially governments, about what they need to know. Related to the myth of increasing crime is my myth number 2, that if we think crime is getting worse, it's not, but if for a minute we imagine that it was getting worse, then it makes sense to think that the answer is to get more police. If only we had more frontline officers, then all our problems would go away. This myth is especially strong whenever there's a state election. I've just put a few quotes up there, but literally there are hundreds of quotes from politicians sensing an impending election and immediately promising more police. It's a vote winner. In fact, however, the research evidence is very clear. Even if crime was worse, appointing more police has no impact on crime and crime reduction. In fact, in some instances, it makes it worse. And the need to find, train and equip these new recruits places enormous logistical strain on police services and actually distracts them from their primary role. So again, the reality is very different to the myth. This leads me on to myth number 3, which is that the primary role of police is to catch bad guys, the lawbreakers. And this myth, of course, is heavily fueled by all those TV police shows that we love to watch so much. There's a crime, police investigate it, solve it, catch the perps, and their job is done. My personal favourite is Olivia Benson, who always catches the perpetrator by the end of the episode of Law and Order Special Victims Units, but there are literally hundreds more of these shows. And again, the reality is very different. Historically, the role of police has always been about keeping the peace, settling disputes, preventing conflict, providing services and responding to emergencies. That's order maintenance and service provision, and that's been historically the primary role of police, and to a large extent it's still the primary role of many police throughout this state, particularly general duty police. The research shows that only about 1/3 of most officers' time is spent on anything like what we would think of as a law enforcement role. Investigations, arrests, that type of thing. For the rest of the time, they conduct welfare checks, they respond to requests for help, they give advice on other government services, they assist the elderly and the young. Something I have personal experience of, they look for old people with dementia who've wandered off from their homes. You name it, they're out there providing this kind of service to the community. If you look at calls for service records received by police, it's truly astonishing the range of things that members of the public call the police to assist them with. This is at least partly because the police are the only 24/7 publicly available agency. It's also, I think, closely related to that traditional role of order maintenance and service provision. We instinctively turn to police for help when we need it. Outside the cities, police do even more of this. They licence and test learner drivers, act as agents for other government departments. In Birdsville in particular, they spend a lot of time looking for tourists lost in the desert, so I'm told. In some parts of this state, police officers have almost no crime to deal with, which is not to suggest that they're not busy. In fact, most of them are run off their feet, but they're doing a range of these other very valuable activities, which really don't fit with our public perception of what policing is all about. A common refrain that I think we would all hear from time to time is that, well, this is all very well, but police should be cops, not social workers. And of course, police aren't trained social workers, and many of them feel uncomfortable adopting this kind of role. But I think the important point that I want to make is that the service provision role is not a failing among police. It's not a dilution of proper policing. It's always been a big part of what policing has been about, and it always should be. The order maintenance and community assistance part of that original Peelian view of policing is probably the most important part of policing. The crime fighter myth, unfortunately, is what leads to a distorted view of what proper policing is. Which leads me to myth number 4, which is related to this and suggests that if we were only all tougher on crime, then there would be less of it and police would be relieved of that obligation. So this is not so much about police, but about giving them more and more powers and equipment, and also making sure that our delinquent courts and judges impose longer and harsher penalties for convicted offenders. Within this myth, police are seen as held back by namby-pamby limits, and the real problem is with those soft judges and their lenient sentences or the tricky defence lawyers. The fact is that in conjunction with the big drop in crime I've mentioned, we've actually seen an even bigger rise in imprisonment. So on the left-hand side there, that's the graph I showed before about the drop in crime, and the right-hand side shows the increase in imprisonment. So even as crime was dropping, we started to imprison more people and for longer and longer periods. This comes as no surprise to a lot of people in the room, but what it shows is that we have got a lot tougher on crime, that actually the criminal justice system now is tougher than it's ever been, and we're all paying for that through our taxes as we contribute to the building of more and more prisons. My last myth, myth number 5, is quite a common one within the policing literature and the policing world, and that's that police actually can't do anything about crime and its associated problems. And this might seem somewhat contradictory to some of the statements I've made earlier about police numbers having no effect on crime, and that in fact much crime is driven by larger social forces. But as I'll get onto in a minute, crime and its associated problems are still a serious issue in some of our communities. And the fact is that police can have an important impact on that problem. But this is not through appointing more police or having them crack down more oppressively on offenders. That only makes things worse. There is clear evidence to show that police can make a difference to communities, but what is important is what they actually do in those communities. What police do in communities counts, and what police do matters. So when we look at what police actually do, it too has changed quite significantly over time. From Peel right through to the early television depictions like Dixon of Dock Green, which I'd never heard of, except all of the policing literature talks about this as the very first television depiction of policing in the UK, police walked the neighbourhood beat. It was their neighbourhood which they knew intimately and which knew them. Their mission was to be readily available and accessible to their communities when help was needed. And this was the original community policing, which we look back at through rose-coloured glasses. As eminent police scholar George Kelling has pointed out, this was changed forever by the advent of two things, the car and the radio. By the 1960s in Australia, following international trends elsewhere, routine police work involved driving around and reacting to radio calls for service from a central dispatcher. These changes to technology drove a change to policing rationale. Now the role was not about knowing the community intimately, but waiting for the community to call in a job and then reacting to it. The service role and the preventive role got a little lost, and so too did that intimate connection with the community. By the 1960s then, the accepted primary practices of policing throughout most of the Western world, including in Australia, were really about three things. Rapid response to calls for service, getting to that job as quickly as possible when dispatched by the radio operator. Random vehicular patrols, driving around suburbs in random patterns, and arresting offenders. The rapid response was thought to increase the likelihood of catching offenders. The routine patrols was meant to deter them, and the arrests was meant to take them off the streets and stop them from offending. So the theory was that this reactive model delivered justice and in the long run made communities safer. And this was reinforced by all of the television portrayals of crime-fighting cops that I've already mentioned. But what really set this in concrete, this methodology, if you like, of policing, was the growth of public management principles in the 1980s and 1990s, which sounds incredibly boring. But what these principles aimed to do was to make sure that governments were getting value for money spent on services, including policing services. This required measurement of what was being achieved. And this is easy for businesses making widgets. You count how many widgets you make, you count up what it costs, and you keep your costs from increasing. For complex social services, it's much harder. The easiest option is to count activities. So if we assume that quick response, random patrols and arrests are effective responses to crime, then that's what we count. And that's how policing gets measured, and that's how government funds policing. What has been missing until quite recently is any thought about whether those activities actually do what they're meant to do. Do they actually reduce crime and make communities safer? And the evidence is now very clear that reactive policing, as I've described it, more police, rapid response, random patrol, and prioritising arrests, does not reduce crime. So governments are actually prioritising policing practices that we know to be ineffective and costly and often counterproductive. And this has become clear, just as there's also been a lot of evidence produced about some of the things that police should be doing instead. Firstly, there was a turn back to the idea of community policing. And this really happened in the United States in the 1970s as a response to some of the widespread police brutality witnessed there during the Vietnam protests and subsequent race riots. The idea was that going back to a closer involvement with the community would re-establish public confidence and legitimacy in policing. Crime reduction, it's important to note, was not the primary purpose of community policing and never was, which is just as well because the evidence shows that it doesn't actually have much impact on reducing crime. It does improve public perceptions of police and it does improve policing legitimacy, but it doesn't help reduce crime. Then along came Herman Goldstein, this year's Stockholm Criminology Prize winner, and his idea of problem-oriented policing. This asks police to identify and address the underlying causes of crime in order to reduce its impact. And despite its popularity over the last 30 years, there's actually surprisingly little evidence that this approach works either. A major review has just been published in the United States looking at all of the evidence on this and other proactive policing strategies. And what it's found is that with things like problem-oriented policing, one of the problems is the implementation. It's all very well working out that a crime problem is caused by absent parenting or problems of addiction, but how are police meant to address that? What can they do to solve that problem? Police largely lack the tools to make a difference, even if they can identify the source of the problem. So other approaches have also developed more recently. A very popular one now is situational crime prevention, and this shifts the focus from dealing with offenders, because we've discovered that it's actually quite hard to make people change. It's a lot easier to change the environments in which they operate. So we can improve lighting, we can change bar practices to reduce the propensity for offending in those environments. And there's quite a lot of evidence to show that this is an effective way to reduce crime. In a similar vein, hotspots policing analyses where crime concentrates so that policing can be intensified there. And there's good evidence to show that this can be effective, although again it's really critical what police actually do in those hotspots. Once they arrive there, how do they actually deal with the problem that's causing crime to concentrate there? And I have to mention third-party policing. It involves police working with partner agencies to identify the sources of crime and to reduce crime problems. And again, there is pretty good evidence that this approach can also be effective. But the emphasis here is on partnerships with those other agencies. And again, much depends on how that partnership is managed and what the police contribution to that partnership is. So the key message about all of these contemporary new approaches to policing is that there is now quite a lot of evidence on which of them are effective and in what situations they can help to reduce crime. And that's a really big step forward. Almost all of these evidence-based practices do not involve conventional law enforcement in the way that we would see it on a television program. They don't involve a focus on arrests and crackdowns. Instead, they ask police to analyse underlying factors and to develop long-term solutions, often working with partnerships and partner agencies to enable them to do that. And if you read police annual reports and mission statements and official documentation from police agencies around the world, this comes as no surprise. Most of the police officers in this room will be saying, "So what? Heard it all before." All of those reports talk about commitments to community policing, problem solving and partnership. The problem is that to a very large extent, this is not filtered through to frontline practices. Studies have repeatedly found that overall frontline policing is still predominantly reactive, still following predominantly the same patterns as it was following in the 1960s. Most time is still spent driving around in cars, responding as quickly as possible to calls for service and in making arrests, or in these days in issuing tickets or notices to appear. So even though crime has reduced so much, the demand for police services has actually grown exponentially. Which seems like a very odd relationship, but what it shows is that we want police to do more, we want them to do it quickly, we want them to be based in our suburbs so that we feel confident that they're around and they're close by. So what we've got is this disconnect between what we know will be effective in policing, and particularly policing to reduce crime, and what police are actually doing, because we as a community want them to do that. We want the visibility of the police station and the street next to me, or the car cruising up and down the street on a random patrol. Unfortunately, this brings me to my next point, which is that the relationship between crime and other social harms has also strengthened over time. If, as I've argued, crime trends are mostly declining, you might say, well, what's the problem? Why do we care so much about what police are doing? If crime's going down, it'll keep on going down, and we can all pack up and go home and go into retirement. Unfortunately, though, while crime has dropped in overall numbers, that's not happened equally everywhere. The evidence shows that crime has clustered and concentrated in certain areas rather than being evenly distributed. And this is not just about good neighbourhoods and bad neighbourhoods. In any neighbourhood, there will be a small number of streets or properties which have repeated severe problems. Some neighbourhoods have more than others, but most will have one or two. Police know this. On any drive along, they can tell you which particular streets are their problem streets, which particular properties they will typically attend 3, 4, 5 times a week, sometimes a night. They know what those properties are. What that means is that in some places crime has almost disappeared to balance out the trend that I've been talking about, while in others it's stayed the same or got a lot worse. I have to pause and say here that, of course, what I'm predominantly talking about is publicly reported crime, and that there are still some crimes that are very hidden and that we actually don't know much about. So even in those areas where there are few or no burglaries, public assaults, car thefts or murders, we know very little about what goes on behind closed doors in terms of family violence and child abuse. What we can say, though, is that if we think about the policing role in those properties, police are almost never called to them, whereas in other areas they're called out frequently to deal with those same kinds of problems and many others as well. So my key message is that reported crime is not spread evenly. This clustering of crime is seen in places, in other places and other crime types. So that what's been referred to as the ironclad rule of crime distribution has been formulated, which says that around 20% of properties or places or people will generate around 80% of any particular type of crime category. And we know now that there's good evidence to show that this is pretty much right. We know that there are fewer people committing offences, but those that do offend are doing so more frequently and often more seriously. So, for example, in one regional city, police said that about 80% of their local property crime was being caused by about 20 young people. The officers knew who these kids were. They frequently arrested and charged them. The kids would be sentenced. They'd often serve a period of detention. They'd get out and they'd start offending again. Enforcing the law in our traditional way seemed to do nothing to break this cycle of offending. And despite what the media says, soft sentencing is not really the answer and actually doesn't really happen. Instead, the research gives some pretty clear answers that have almost nothing to do with police or magistrates. It gives us reasons for the crime drop, an improved economy, higher education levels, reduced opportunities for offending, changes in social activities, particularly of teenagers who stay in their bedrooms and no longer go out and get into trouble. And therefore, offending has dropped. But it also suggests why crime has increased in some areas and among some people. And again, these reasons are almost entirely social, technological and economic. So just like crime, social disadvantage has become increasingly clustered. This means poverty, unemployment, low school attendance, high rates of drug and alcohol dependency and mental health issues. What is the impact on this clustering of reactive law enforcement, arrests and crackdowns? It can clear the streets temporarily, but it does nothing to address the underlying problem. The social ecology that supports crime, violence and other problems in those areas remains unchanged. So we can't fix this with more law and order. Enforcement drives up in imprisonment rates, but that only makes things worse. We know that people coming out of prison have even less chance of re-engaging with jobs and education and the other factors that will stop them from offending in the future. Much of the answer to this, as I've said, lies beyond the police. My colleague Ross Hommel and his team are showing how broad community-led projects can start to address some of these problems with young people from a very young age. And police can be part of that solution, or they can make things worse. And my argument is that in many cases, reactive policing and law enforcement makes things worse. If we really want long-term reductions in crime across all communities, then our fundamental perceptions about the police role need to change. There needs to be much less focus on law and order and much more on those underlying social factors causing crime. We need a harm reduction approach to policing. So what do I mean by harm and harm reduction? Well, harm reduction is an idea borrowed from public health, where authorities have developed it as a way of dealing with epidemics. The idea is to focus on preventing the spread of the worst adverse outcomes of disease, the harm. Think, for example, of HIV/AIDS. Australia's world-leading policy approach in the 1980s, of which the Grim Reaper ads were one arm, focused on stopping deaths through encouraging safe sex and injection practices. We did this better than anywhere else in the world because we focused not on whether this was a gay problem or a drug user problem, but simply on how we could reduce known harms until treatments and prevention could be developed. Harm reduction jumped policy domains when it became part of Australia's official illicit drug policy framework in the 1990s. So our drugs policy is not just to enforce the law, but also to limit the harms that drugs cause, for example, by providing needle exchanges and safe injecting rooms for addicts. In doing this, we accept that we cannot eliminate all drug use, and certainly to do so is beyond the realm of police. But we can stop people from dying and enable them to perhaps access treatment and other forms of prevention to occur. So the target of a harm reduction approach is the damage that could be caused, not the drug itself. Well, I think communities face many harms, some of which are crimes. violence is largely a crime, although this has only been true, as we know, of family violence in recent years. Some forms of violence, like intentionally or negligently inflicted injuries, such as those that occur in workplaces or from faulty products, are still not crimes. Property theft is criminal, but Facebook taking my personal data apparently is not. The point that I make is that not all harms are crimes, but almost all crimes cause harm. That's why those behaviours are criminalised in the first place. And if we look at those behaviours only through the lens of criminal justice, we are maybe missing the most effective way of addressing the harms that they cause. So harm reduction is inherently preventive, not reactive. We want to stop the problem from happening, or at least reduce its intensity. Whereas traditional law enforcement is reactive. We wait for the crime to be committed, the harm to be inflicted, then we find the person responsible, we apportion blame, we make them pay. Therefore, there's a strong philosophical connection, I think, between preventive policing, proactive policing, problem-solving policing, and harm reduction. And if we start to think about those activities in a harm reduction framework, we might have some prospects of convincing the rest of the community about that. This is not to say that the investigation and arrest of offenders is not important. It will always be a significant part of policing. It's an important contributor to justice for victims and social retribution for serious wrongs that are committed. But police, I think, also have a role in harm reduction. But this requires somewhat of a shift in mindset from us perceiving officers as crime fighters to this broader role that I've been talking about. A harm reduction approach would recognise that much crime co-occurs with other harms, like mental illness, addiction, homelessness, and family dysfunction. And many of these harms are only made worse, as I've said, by standard policing and criminal justice models. This applies not just to the individuals who are caught up in the behaviours, but also to their families and their communities, which suffer the churn as these people cycle in and out of prison. So it's time to start thinking of policing as part of this broader public safety and security agenda that seeks to address harms in an integrated way. What then would harm reduction policing look like? Well, the first thing that I want to acknowledge is that it already happens. We already see it in some domains of policing. For the last 20 or 30 years at least, road policing throughout Australia has been directed at reducing deaths and injuries rather than law enforcement as an end to itself. We all accept implicitly that when we're stopped, not that this has ever happened to me, and been given a speeding ticket or caught up in a random breath test, that this is not just about law enforcement and it's not just about generating revenue, it's about making the roads safer. There is a harm reduction policy objective that we all clearly understand and most of us sign on to. So this is a model approach, I think, for harm reduction in policing in other areas. There is, and I'm not going to suggest that there is not already harm reduction in other domains of policing. When children are out late at night and they're taken home by police, when drunks are put into taxis, when people who've taken overdoses on footpaths are kept awake. This is all happening now all throughout the state. But the difference is that activity is sporadic. It depends on the individuals involved, the context, how busy they are, when their shift finishes. It's not built into the system of policing. Compare that to road policing again, where police are held publicly accountable to targets for reduced numbers of deaths. They're published in the media and there's a running commentary on how we're going in meeting that target. And this has come to be seen as the primary goal for road policing. What if we had harm-based goals for all areas of policing, not just road policing? With such an approach to illicit drugs, for example, police would be prioritising reducing risks to users and deaths from overdoses. Needle exchanges might be joined by pill testing at festivals rather than sniffer dogs, as we see in some states, not Queensland, I hasten to point out, which the evidence clearly shows causes more overdoses than it prevents. The target would be to reduce those overdoses and not simply have arrests for the sake of arrests. There would also be closer attention paid to the harms that drug use inflicts on others. So the victims of property crime, of course, where those crimes are being committed to fuel a drug habit, but also offenders' families. When police investigate a drug offence? Is there evidence of some forms of domestic violence or child abuse or neglect that is related to the addiction problems happening in that household? What steps can police take to improve that family's welfare? What services can they connect people to? As I said, I know this is happening to some extent in policing currently. My argument is that we need to make it systemic. We need to build it into the organisation of policing and our expectations of policing. A harm-focused approach to policing would reorientate the system of policing to identifying and reducing harms, with arrests and law enforcement seen as just one worthwhile part of the toolbox for achieving this. The other practices of proactive policing that I've talked about would also become part of that approach. And I want to finish up with 3 key steps which I think are required for such a systemic shift. The first is to truly understand what harms affect our communities and how communities perceive and prioritise those harms. What should be the focus of police attention and what do communities think? And I say communities because, of course, this will vary depending on where you are in the state. We don't know the answer to that question. Our data on crime and victimisation has always been about frequency counts. How often are these things happening? How many burglaries have there been in a given year? This tells us how many offences have been committed, but it doesn't tell us how serious they are or how much harm they cause. Most people would say that the theft of a car is less serious than a murder or a rape, yet when we count crimes, they're all counted equally. So in the crime trend data that I've showed you, a rape counts for the same as a burglary or a car theft. That doesn't seem right because the levels of harm caused are significantly different. By the same token, we know that people in communities care about a lot of non-crime harms as well. They care about disorder in their environment. They care about messy streets. They care about noise. They care about hooning. They care about graffiti. Our current framework for measuring crime largely ignores those types of things which people are very concerned about. So we need a better measure of harm. And there are several attempts going on around the world at the moment to develop this, including, I have to say, a very, very clever and sophisticated one being developed here in Queensland and led by QPS. And I think this is a great first step in telling us about what harms matter most in our communities. The second step is to holistically evaluate how policing affects those harms at an individual level, both positively and negatively. Will aggressive law enforcement improve or intensify the harm? In the United States, for example, we've seen how the so-called stop, question and frisk policy, which has had only a tiny effect on reducing street crimes in most big cities in the States, has actually led to a significant amount of racial profiling, very large community unrest and violent backlashes. That is a situation where police activities have much intensified the harm that was occurring. So careful thought needs to be given to whether police are the answer, because they won't always be the answer. Sometimes they'll be better off mobilising and assisting other social services. And this really needs to be part of the problem analysis phase. And the third step is to refocus police efforts on activities that most reduce harm, rather than on reducing crime counts, and to value those activities. We need to stop measuring police by simple crime counts and arrest numbers. Are our communities safer and better places? Have police played a constructive role in achieving that? These are the questions we should ask, we should find measures of, and we should fund police to do, even if they don't really fit our traditional conception of what a real cop is. And that might mean that we have to reflect at some point in time about the nature of people we recruit into policing and how we train them and the tasks that we train them for. Perhaps we don't need police to be social workers, but we need more social workers to be police. That might be one of the way forwards. Let me finish by saying again that much police work, in my view, is already harm-focused. Many individual officers care very much about the communities they work in. My message is really aimed at us, the public, the media, and particularly our governments. We need to recognise and value the real work of policing and understand that the image of the cop as vengeful enforcer belongs on TV. Peel's vision of community-engaged police contributing to safety, security and public services is a much better approach, and harm reduction can help us get there. We will all be safer if police are allowed to focus less on law enforcement and more on reducing crime and associated harms. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Janet, for that wonderful journey, a very thoughtful journey, and a very symmetrical journey from the past to the future to bring us back to the past with a future informed by the past. Colleagues, we have about 5 minutes for questions, so please raise your hand. We've got a roving mic, I think. Janet's happy to take your questions. Here's a question over here in the front.
Not from Ross. No.
Thank you. Terrific lecture. Harm reduction and traditional policing, intelligence-led and so on, strikes me that, I don't know this for sure, this is a question, has Australian police been particularly effective in preventing terrorist attacks, say over the last 10 or 15 years? My impression is that we have been quite successful. There have been a lot of announcements of incidents that were thwarted. Been relatively few successful terrorist incidents as far as I can remember. Is this an example where reasonably traditional police methods undergirded by good data and intelligence is actually achieving harm reduction in a very significant way?
It's a good question, Ross, and I don't know the answer, I don't know the data, and I don't know that anyone has actually compared the Australian approach to the approaches elsewhere. You could argue we've been lucky, that our success in, if you like, in counter-terrorism has been just as much a function of where we are geographically. You could argue that it's a function of our multicultural policies that governments have been committed to for many decades now, which have not bred some of the problems that we see in the UK, for example. I don't know the answer. I think that some of the research that's being done by people like Tina Murphy about how police engage with Muslim communities is very interesting, and I know one of the things that she's going to be looking at is comparing that engagement in Queensland and New South Wales, because perceptions held by the Muslim communities in those two states of police are quite different. So it'll be quite interesting to see why police are perceived much less problematically in Queensland than they are in New South Wales. So the answer is we need more good research.
Good answer. Any other questions? Yeah, there's one here in the front.
Justin?
Justin, coming here right here.
Thank you, Janet. That was a great lecture. Really picked up speed at the end, got my mind racing. Okay, so here's my question. The implication behind your talk is that the distribution and the clustering of crime may be slightly different than the geographic distribution and the clustering of harms, and that crime hotspots might overlap but slightly differently with harm hotspots. Yep. And this seems to jibe with some work that I'm doing in Baltimore that finds that places that are violent crime hotspots actually have severe and persistent problems with post-traumatic stress and depression. So the implication behind this is anticipatory policing, where we can start to look at perhaps harm hotspots, but that implies the police need to work with, for instance, other groups, for instance, healthcare providers, in starting to kind of strategically target those harms. And do you have any kind of thoughts about this?
Well, I think you're absolutely right about harm hotspots, and there's a body of work being done in the UK on that as well, and a body of work being done in Queensland, indeed, trying to produce harm hotspots and compare them to crime hotspots. And I think it's fair to say that generally the distributions can be quite different to what you would expect. Whilst there can be clusters of high occurrences of crime in certain areas, they are often low harm crimes. They're often, break and enters, which are very harmful to the person experiencing that. I can testify to that. but they don't compare to the other forms of harm like child abuse, child sexual abuse, rape and murder that we're seeing costed in other areas. And yes, clearly, and I think I've tried to make this point, police don't have all the answers to those kinds of harms. A law enforcement answer is probably not the answer. What might be needed is a multi-agency team response where police work very closely with other teams. We're seeing that in the domestic violence sphere now in Queensland, and there's some really promising results coming from some of those approaches. Sometimes it might mean no police involvement at all, because some communities might prefer that approach, and there might be more trust and confidence in a health-led initiative. And I think that probably the key message is there's probably not one size fits all. We probably need to analyse the problem, work out what the contributors are, and develop special specific solutions for each place that problem occurs in. And that's a time-intensive and possibly expensive process, but it's no more expensive than just promising 500 new cops every time there's an election. So I think you're right. I think that's where the future lies.
Time for one final question for Janet. Put it in the back.
Thank you, Janet. That was a very good lecture. I really enjoyed it. My name's Harry Venison. I'm from Griffith in Humanities. I spent a little bit of time in the Murray Court at Wynnum and Cleveland, and it seems to me we get into the court system, offenders come in, the prosecutor, does the case, and the magistrates sort of sit there and say, what are these people doing here? The police seem to come in and say, well, this is the process, we've got no choice, and the magistrates are looking for alternatives. So they seem to direct a lot of the offenders into alcohol, tobacco and other drugs, counselling, all sorts of things other than incarceration. So it seems to happen at that level. So I guess we want to take it back a step into the policing, but I guess my question is sort of tangential in terms of how do we convince governments to direct those funds towards those sorts of areas?
Again, a very, very good question. I have to acknowledge that the person who established the Murray Courts in Queensland is sitting in the room. So, Di Fingleton, we owe you a big debt for doing that. And Tina as well, thank you very much for that contribution. And I think you're right, and I think this gets to the central conundrum that I was talking about, which is that there is a perception, I think, in government that what communities want is toughness. They want a law and order approach, and there's a nervousness in government about being seen to be soft on crime. Part of it's fueled by the media. We love to blame the media for these types of things, but I think what we need to be able to show is strong and cogent evidence and an alternative, and to keep on hammering away at governments with that strong and cogent evidence and a logical alternative to show that this kind of approach can work and it can be more effective and that we can achieve longer term outcomes. Perhaps I'm an optimist, but I think that's all we can do because really I'm not being critical of either side of governments. All governments like to have law and order campaigns, and that hasn't changed for a long time.
Well, why don't we end the questions there, because we have time in the foyer for some more networking and follow-ups with Janet. And she did say an important word just a second ago, which is she's an optimist. And I think that's a great space to land on. The future looks bright, and the future is clearly informed by your reflections and your observations, Janet. So can I thank you on behalf of everybody here for a wonderful AEL professorial lecture. Thank you again.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah? Okay.